Before I tell you this story that completely changed my life, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever felt small, overlooked, or like the world was stacked against you, hit that like button right now. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story. It's proof that sometimes, just when you think you're at your lowest point, the universe has a way of turning everything upside down in the most beautiful way possible. I'm talking about real karma here, not the kind you see in movies, but the raw, unbelievable kind that happens when you refuse to give up on what's right. The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice, love, and second chances. So go ahead and subscribe, because I promise you, after hearing what happened to me in that courtroom, you'll never look at someone struggling the same way again. And trust me, you're going to want to share this story with everyone you know. Because sometimes we all need a reminder that miracles don't just happen in fairy tales, they happen to real people like you and me, when we least expect them, but need them the most. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I was just another single mother trying to make it through each day. I worked double shifts as a night nurse at City General Hospital, came home to help my 8-year-old daughter Maya with her homework, and fell into bed exhausted, only to wake up and do it all over again. But I didn't mind the exhaustion, because everything I did was for her. My brilliant, beautiful girl who could solve math problems that stumped kids twice her age and read books meant for high schoolers. That's exactly why I found myself standing in that cold, intimidating courtroom on what started as the worst day of my life. Maya had been attending prestigious academy, one of the city's most elite private schools, on a partial scholarship she'd earned through her exceptional test scores. For months, I'd watched my confident, happy daughter slowly shrink into herself. Her teachers began excluding her from advanced programs she qualified for. They moved her to the back of the classroom. Parent-teacher conferences became sessions where they'd find new ways to suggest she might be happier at a different school. The breaking point came when Maya, who had the highest science grades in her class, was passed over for the school's gifted program in favor of students with lower scores but wealthier parents. When I questioned it, they gave me excuses that made my stomach turn. "She's not quite ready for that level of challenge," they said, while my daughter sobbed in my arms that night, asking me why she wasn't good enough. So there I stood in that courtroom, wearing my best dress, which was really just my church dress, with a small stain I'd tried desperately to hide, holding a folder of documents I'd printed at the library, because our home printer had broken months ago. I was representing myself because I couldn't afford a lawyer, going up against Sterling, Hayes, and Associates, the kind of law firm that charged more per hour than I made in a week. The opposing side looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine, perfectly pressed suits, leather briefcases that probably cost more than my car, and that air of confidence that comes from never having to worry about whether you can afford your next meal. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing at me with barely concealed amusement, as if my presence there was some kind of joke they were all in on. The moment I walked into that courtroom, I felt every pair of eyes on me, and not in a good way. The opposing legal team, 3 lawyers who looked like they'd never missed a meal or worried about a bill in their lives, exchanged glances that said everything. One of them, a sharp-faced woman in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, actually smirked when she saw my worn folder held together with a rubber band. The school board members sat in their section like royalty holding court, whispering behind manicured hands and shooting looks in my direction that made my cheeks burn. I recognized some of them from school events, the same people who'd smile politely when I volunteered for bake sales, but somehow never remembered my name, despite Maya being in their children's classes for 2 years. I tried to organize my papers with shaking hands, fully aware that my documentation looked pathetic compared to their thick, professionally bound files. Every time I rustled through my folder, searching for the right document, I could hear quiet chuckles from their table. The lead attorney, a silver-haired man who radiated the kind of authority that comes from winning cases for people with deep pockets, leaned over to whisper something to his colleague that made them both laugh quietly. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it. I'd practiced my opening statement in the mirror for weeks, but sitting there surrounded by all that wealth and power, the words seemed to evaporate from my mind. I felt like a fraud, like I was playing dress-up in a world where I didn't belong. The worst part wasn't their expensive clothes or confident demeanor, it was the way they looked at me like I was wasting their time. Like a single mother working night shifts to pay for her daughter's education was somehow less worthy of justice than their clients with trust funds and country club memberships. When the bailiff called the court to order, I straightened my shoulders and reminded myself why I was there. Maya's tear-stained face, the night they rejected her from the gifted program, flashed in my mind. My daughter deserved better than their prejudice and assumptions. I might not have had their money or their fancy degrees, but I had something they didn't: a mother's love and an unshakable belief that my child was worth fighting for, no matter how small they tried to make me feel. When it came time for me to present my case, I stood up on trembling legs, clutching my folder like a lifeline. I started by telling Maya's story, how she'd scored in the 99th percentile on her entrance exams, how her standardized test scores consistently ranked among the top 3 in her grade, how she'd won the school science fair 2 years running before they mysteriously stopped letting her participate. I pulled out crumpled copies of her report cards, her test scores, letters of recommendation from her previous teachers who had called her exceptional and gifted beyond her years. My voice shook as I described how my confident, curious daughter had slowly been crushed under the weight of being treated like she didn't belong. The opposing counsel barely looked up from their phones. One of them was actually checking his watch, as if my daughter's pain was boring him. When I mentioned how Maya had been excluded from the advanced reading group, despite having the highest comprehension scores in her class, the silver-haired lead attorney rolled his eyes so dramatically that the judge had to have seen it. Their defense was as polished as their appearances, and twice as cutting. They stood up with charts and graphs, speaking in legal jargon that made my head spin. They painted Maya as struggling to keep up with the rigorous academic standards and suggested that my unrealistic expectations were the real problem. They had character witnesses, teachers who testified that Maya was distracted and not quite ready for advanced placement, conveniently forgetting to mention that she'd been moved to the back of every classroom and excluded from group activities. The most devastating moment came when they called Mrs. Henderson, Maya's 4th-grade teacher, to testify. This woman had smiled at me during parent conferences, had told me how proud she was of Maya's progress, but standing in that witness box, she transformed into someone I didn't recognize, claiming Maya had behavioral issues and difficulty following instructions. Lies that cut through me like broken glass. I watched in horror as they systematically dismantled my daughter's character, turning her quiet sadness at being excluded into defiance and her academic excellence into grade inflation from previous schools. Each word felt like a physical blow, and I could see some of the school board members nodding along, as if this character assassination of an 8-year-old child made perfect sense to them. By the time they finished their presentation, I felt like I was drowning in their lies and manipulation. When I stood up for my rebuttal, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my papers. I tried to counter their lies with the truth. Maya's actual test scores, documentation of her achievements, emails where teachers had praised her work before the discrimination began. But every time I spoke, the lead attorney would object with some legal term I didn't understand, and the judge would sustain it with barely concealed impatience. Then it happened. The moment that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. I was trying to explain how Maya's grades had dropped only after she'd been systematically excluded from advanced programs, when the silver-haired lawyer, Mr. Sterling himself, actually laughed out loud. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, condescending laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, rising with theatrical flair, We're supposed to take seriously the legal arguments of someone who clearly doesn't understand basic courtroom procedure. Perhaps Ms. Johnson should have considered her limitations before wasting the court's valuable time. The entire opposing side erupted. The other lawyers chuckled behind their hands. The school board members smiled and whispered among themselves. Even some of the court staff looked amused. I stood there, feeling the heat of humiliation wash over me, as they laughed at my pain, at my daughter's future, at everything I was fighting for. Judge Morrison, a man who clearly moved in the same social circles as these people, didn't even bother to restore order. Instead, he looked at me with the kind of pity you'd give a lost child. "Ms. Johnson," he said, in a tone that made my skin crawl, "perhaps you should reconsider whether this is really the best use of everyone's time. These are serious legal matters that require expertise." The words hit me like physical blows. "Know your place," was what he was really saying. "Stay in your lane. Don't reach above your station." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these people who already saw me as weak. Sterling wasn't finished. "Maybe," he said with a sharp smile, "single mothers should focus on getting their own lives in order before pointing fingers at respected institutions." The laughter that followed was the cruelest sound I'd ever heard. I was completely alone, drowning in their mockery, questioning whether justice even existed for people like me. What happened next was worse than anything I could have imagined. Sterling wasn't content to just dismiss my case. He wanted to destroy me personally. He stood there in his $1,000 suit, looking at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe, and delivered blow after devastating blow. "Your Honor," he said with mock concern, "we have to consider the source of these allegations. Ms. Johnson is a single mother working night shifts, clearly struggling to provide basic stability for her child. Perhaps Maya's academic difficulties stem from the chaos at home rather than any imagined discrimination at our prestigious institution." The words cut through me like a knife. He was using my hard work, my sacrifice, my determination to provide for my daughter, as weapons against me. Every double shift I'd worked, every night I'd stayed up helping Maya with homework while fighting exhaustion, every sacrifice I'd made, he twisted it all into evidence of my inadequacy. But he wasn't done. Furthermore, Sterling continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "We must question whether Ms. Johnson's limited understanding of academic standards might be coloring her perception of her daughter's actual abilities. Sometimes, what appears to be discrimination is simply reality meeting unrealistic expectations." The school board members nodded along like bobbleheads, and I watched their faces carefully. These were people who drove cars that cost more than I'd make in 5 years, who sent their children to summer camps that cost more than my annual rent. They looked at me and saw exactly what Sterling wanted them to see. A woman who didn't know her place, who was reaching too high, who needed to be put back in her box. The financial mockery came next. One of Sterling's associates made a point of mentioning how I was representing myself due to obvious financial constraints, as if my inability to afford their kind of legal representation somehow invalidated my daughter's right to equal treatment. They joked about how I'd printed my documents at the public library, how my evidence was held together with rubber bands instead of professional binding. The racist undertones weren't even subtle anymore. Sterling made pointed comments about certain people expecting special treatment and how standards exist for a reason. When he suggested that Maya might be more comfortable at a school better suited to her background, everyone in that room knew exactly what he meant. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller with each cruel word, ready to walk out and never come back. Just as I was gathering my papers, ready to flee from that nightmare and never look back, the heavy courtroom doors burst open with a sound that echoed through the entire chamber like thunder. Every head turned, every conversation stopped mid-sentence, and the laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was so complete, You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. A man walked through those doors with the kind of presence that changes the energy of a room simply by existing. Tall, impeccably dressed, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sterling's entire wardrobe. He moved with quiet confidence that made everyone else suddenly look small and insignificant. His dark eyes swept the courtroom, taking in every face, every detail, before landing on me. My heart stopped, literally stopped beating for what felt like an eternity. Because I knew that face, those eyes, that gentle smile that was now spreading across his features as he looked at me. It was Marcus, my Marcus, the man I'd married in a quiet courthouse ceremony just 6 months ago. The secret I'd been keeping while fighting this legal battle. The entire courtroom was frozen in confusion. Sterling's mouth was literally hanging open. Judge Morrison was staring like he'd seen a ghost. The school board members looked like someone had just told them their trust funds had evaporated. Because even though I'd kept our marriage private, everyone in this room knew exactly who Marcus Thompson was. Marcus Thompson, the billionaire tech mogul whose company had revolutionized online education. The man whose donations had funded half the hospitals in the city. Whose foundation provided scholarships to underprivileged students. Whose face graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes magazines. The same man who was now walking straight toward me with love and determination written across every feature. He didn't acknowledge the stunned silence, didn't pause to explain himself to the slack-jawed lawyers or the confused judge. He walked directly to where I stood, still clutching my pathetic folder, still reeling from their cruel words, still feeling like the smallest person in the room. And then, in front of everyone who had just finished humiliating me, he did something that changed everything. He reached for my face with gentle hands, looked into my eyes with all the love and respect these people had refused to show me, and kissed me. Not a peck, not a polite greeting, but a real kiss that said everything about who I was to him. The kiss lasted only seconds, but it felt like the world had stopped spinning. When Marcus pulled back, he kept his hands on my face, his thumb gently wiping away a tear I didn't even realize had fallen. "I'm sorry I'm late, my love," he whispered, just loud enough for the front rows to hear. "Traffic was terrible, and I couldn't bear the thought of you facing this alone for another minute. My love." He'd called me his love in front of everyone, and the shock on their faces was almost comical if it weren't for the gravity of everything that had just happened. But I knew they deserved an explanation, and more importantly, I needed them to understand that this wasn't some elaborate setup or coincidence. Marcus and I had met 8 months ago, during one of the worst nights of his life, and one of the longest of mine. I was working the night shift in the ICU when paramedics rushed him in after a devastating car accident on the interstate. He'd been unconscious, bleeding, broken in ways that made me fear for his life. For 72 hours, I barely left his side, monitoring his vitals, adjusting his medications, talking to him, even when the doctors said he couldn't hear me. When he finally woke up, the first face he saw was mine. Later, he told me that in those hazy moments of consciousness, he thought I was an angel. We talked during his recovery, really talked, about everything and nothing. He wasn't the billionaire Marcus Thompson in that hospital bed. He was just Marcus, a man who'd built an empire, but realized he had no one to share it with. Our romance was quiet, secret, beautiful in its simplicity. He would pick me up after my shifts, and we'd drive to the lake to watch the sunrise. He'd help Maya with her math homework while I cooked dinner, never making her feel like his presence was charity or obligation. He loved us both, completely and unconditionally, from the very beginning. We married on a Tuesday morning 6 months ago, in a simple courthouse ceremony with just Maya as our witness. We'd planned to go public after my legal battle was over, not wanting his wealth and influence to overshadow the justice Maya deserved. But as he watched these people tear me apart from afar, because yes, he'd been following every detail of this case, he couldn't stay away another second. "Mrs. Thompson," he said now, and I saw Sterling actually stumble backward at those words. The transformation in that courtroom was instantaneous and absolute. You could literally see the color drain from Sterling's face as the reality hit him like a freight train. Judge Morrison, who had been looking at me with barely concealed disdain just moments before, suddenly straightened in his chair, his entire demeanor shifting from dismissive to respectful in the span of a heartbeat. Marcus kept his arm around my waist as he surveyed the room with calm authority. "I believe," he said in that quiet, controlled voice that had negotiated billion-dollar deals, "my wife was presenting her case when I arrived. Please, continue." The word wife seemed to echo in the stunned silence, and I watched as every person who had just been laughing at me began to squirm in their seats. Sterling tried to recover, attempted that same condescending smile he'd been wearing all day, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of steel that had built his empire, "is how my wife and stepdaughter have been treated by your clients. And trust me, Mr. Sterling, I've been paying very close attention to every word spoken in this courtroom today." The school board members looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. These were people who had donated to Marcus's foundation, who had begged for invitations to his charity galas, who had spent years trying to get into his social circle, and now they realized they had just systematically humiliated and discriminated against his family. Judge Morrison cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No recess necessary, Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly. "But I believe my wife deserves the respect and attention that should have been given to her from the beginning. She has something important to say, and this court is going to listen." What happened next was like watching dominoes fall in the most satisfying way possible. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a single call. "David," he said calmly, "I need the legal team in courtroom 3B immediately. Yes, all of them. And bring the Thompson Foundation files on educational discrimination cases." Within minutes, the courtroom doors opened again, and 6 of the city's most feared attorneys walked in, led by David Chen, the man who had never lost a case in his 20-year career. Sterling's confident smirk finally cracked as he realized he was no longer the apex predator in this room. But the real power shift came when Marcus nodded to David, who opened a thick file and began reading. "Your Honor, the Thompson Foundation has been conducting a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices at elite private schools for the past 18 months. Prestigious Academy has been under surveillance during that entire period." The blood drained from every school board member's face. They hadn't just discriminated against Maya. They had done it while unknowingly being investigated by one of the most powerful foundations in the country. "We have documented evidence," David continued, his voice cutting through the stunned silence, "of systematic racial discrimination, financial bias, and deliberate exclusion of qualified minority students. This includes recorded conversations, email communications, and testimony from former staff members who were terminated for refusing to participate in these practices." Sterling tried to interrupt, but David held up a hand. "Furthermore, we have evidence that similar patterns exist with 17 other students currently enrolled at prestigious Academy, and 43 students who have been driven out over the past 3 years. Judge Morrison's face had gone pale. The school board members were frantically whispering among themselves, and I could see the panic in their eyes. What had started as their entertainment, watching them destroy a single mother in court, had suddenly become their worst nightmare. The hunter had become the hunted. The evidence that David's team presented was devastating and undeniable. Email chains where teachers discussed keeping standards high by limiting minority students in advanced programs. Recorded phone calls where board members laughed about scholarship kids who don't know their place. Financial records showing how qualified minority students were systematically denied merit-based aid that went to less qualified wealthy students. But the most damaging evidence was a recording from just 2 weeks ago, a school board meeting where they discussed my case specifically. I listened in horror and vindication as their voices filled the courtroom, saying things like, "That woman needs to learn her lesson," and "We can't have these people thinking they can just demand whatever they want." Judge Morrison, who had been so dismissive of me an hour earlier, was now leaning forward, hanging on every word. The same man who had suggested I reconsider wasting the court's time was now ordering an immediate settlement conference. Sterling's team was in full retreat mode, desperately trying to negotiate behind hushed whispers. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, the discrimination was clear, and now they faced not just my case, but a federal investigation into their entire institution. The settlement they offered was staggering, more money than I'd ever imagined. Enough to secure Maya's education at any school she chose, enough to ensure she'd never face financial barriers to her dreams. But more than the money was the admission of guilt, the forced policy changes, the mandatory diversity training, the oversight committee that would monitor their practices for years to come. Maya would get justice, but more importantly, dozens of other children would be protected from what she had endured. The system that had tried to break us was being forced to change, and the people who had laughed at our pain were now scrambling to save their reputations. As we signed the settlement papers, Marcus squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'm so proud of you. You did this. Your courage, your determination. This victory belongs to you." He was wrong, though. This victory belonged to every parent who had ever been told their child wasn't good enough, every family who had been made to feel small, every person who had been laughed out of rooms where they deserved to be heard. The moment the settlement was finalized, the transformation was complete and utterly satisfying. Sterling, who had spent the morning mocking my limited understanding and suggesting I didn't belong in his courtroom, was now approaching me with the most pathetic attempt at an apologetic smile I'd ever seen. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, and I noticed how carefully he pronounced my married name now. "I hope you understand that this was never personal. We were simply advocating zealously for our clients, as is our professional duty." His voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by the desperate tone of a man trying to save face. The school board members were even more pitiful. Mrs. Whitfield, who had rolled her eyes at every word I'd spoken, was now gushing about how misunderstandings happen and how she'd always admired Maya's potential. The same woman who had whispered cruel comments about my appearance was now complimenting my strength and dedication. But the sweetest moment came when Judge Morrison requested a private word with Marcus and me. The man who had treated me like an inconvenience, who had suggested I was wasting the court's time, was now stumbling over himself to apologize for any misperceptions about the proceedings. Within hours, news of the case had spread throughout the city's social circles. By evening, it was trending on social media. "Single mother takes down elite, school discrimination." My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and invitations to join boards and committees fighting educational inequality. Sterling tried to interrupt, but David held up a hand. "Furthermore, we have evidence that similar patterns exist with 17 other students currently enrolled at prestigious academy, and 43 students who have been driven out over the past 3 years. Judge Morrison's face had gone pale. The school board members were frantically whispering among themselves, and I could see the panic in their eyes. What had started as their entertainment, watching them destroy a single mother in court, had suddenly become their worst nightmare. The hunter had become the hunted. The evidence that David's team presented was devastating and undeniable. Email chains where teachers discussed keeping standards high by limiting minority students in advanced programs. Recorded phone calls where board members laughed about scholarship kids who don't know their place, financial records showing how qualified minority students were systematically denied merit-based aid that went to less qualified wealthy students. But the most damaging evidence was a recording from just 2 weeks ago, a school board meeting where they discussed my case specifically. I listened in horror and vindication as their voices filled the courtroom, saying things like, "That woman needs to learn her lesson," and "We can't have these people thinking they can just demand whatever they want." Judge Morrison, who had been so dismissive of me an hour earlier, was now leaning forward, hanging on every word. The same man who had suggested I reconsider wasting the court's time was now ordering an immediate settlement conference. Sterling's team was in full retreat mode, desperately trying to negotiate behind hushed whispers. But it was too late. The evidence was overwhelming, the discrimination was clear, and now they faced not just my case, but a federal investigation into their entire institution. The settlement they offered was staggering, more money than I'd ever imagined. Enough to secure Maya's education at any school she chose, enough to ensure she'd never face financial barriers to her dreams. But more than the money was the admission of guilt, the forced policy changes, the mandatory diversity training, the oversight committee that would monitor their practices for years to come. Maya would get justice, but more importantly, dozens of other children would be protected from what she had endured. The system that had tried to break us was being forced to change, and the people who had laughed at our pain were now scrambling to save their reputations. As we signed the settlement papers, Marcus squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'm so proud of you. You did this. Your courage, your determination. This victory belongs to you." He was wrong, though. This victory belonged to every parent who had ever been told their child wasn't good enough, every family who had been made to feel small, every person who had been laughed out of rooms where they deserved to be heard. The moment the settlement was finalized, the transformation was complete and utterly satisfying. Sterling, who had spent the morning mocking my limited understanding and suggesting I didn't belong in his courtroom, was now approaching me with the most pathetic attempt at an apologetic smile I'd ever seen. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, and I noticed how carefully he pronounced my married name now. "I hope you understand that this was never personal. We were simply advocating zealously for our clients, as is our professional duty." His voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by the desperate tone of a man trying to save face. The school board members were even more pitiful. Mrs. Whitfield, who had rolled her eyes at every word I'd spoken, was now gushing about how misunderstandings happen and how she'd always admired Maya's potential. The same woman who had whispered cruel comments about my appearance was now complimenting my strength and dedication. But the sweetest moment came when Judge Morrison requested a private word with Marcus and me. The man who had treated me like an inconvenience, who had suggested I was wasting the court's time, was now stumbling over himself to apologize for any misperceptions about the proceedings. Within hours, news of the case had spread throughout the city's social circles. By evening, it was trending on social media. "Single mother takes down elite, school discrimination." My phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and invitations to join boards and committees fighting educational inequality. But don't stop there. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Maybe it's a single parent feeling overwhelmed, a student being treated unfairly, or anyone who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere they have every right to be. Sometimes all we need is one story that proves the impossible is possible, that David really can beat Goliath, and that love and justice can show up in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and hit that notification bell, because I promise you, Maya and I aren't done fighting for families who need advocates. We're sharing more stories of real people who refuse to give up, who found their voices in the darkest moments, and who discovered that sometimes your lowest point is just the launching pad for your greatest victory. Now tell me in the comments, Have you ever felt like that version of me in the courtroom? Small and powerless. What gave you the strength to keep fighting? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Because here's what I've learned: we're not meant to fight these battles alone. When we share our struggles and our victories, we create a community of warriors who lift each other up. Remember, you are stronger than you know, braver than you feel, and more worthy of respect than anyone who tries to make you feel small.